Good morning, Lenore.
Morning, Bridie.
Good morning, Mike.
Hey, Bridie.
And good morning, Joe.
Morning, Bridie.
This week, we've had some different types of data come out that paint a picture of family life, in particular women's lives. Joe, what did it show?
Well, that's right. So this week we got a couple of reports that painted a pretty sobering look at the progress of gender equality in Australia. So the first one was on Tuesday. There was a report from the Workplace Gender Equality Agency on the gender pay gap. And what it showed was there has not been a lot of progress on that in recent years. Women are still earning 78 cents on the dollar compared to men in this country. The pay gap is narrowing slightly, and there are fewer companies now that have a stark gender pay gap compared to last year. But nevertheless, it remains, and it remains among most large companies. So 72% of companies, major companies in Australia, have a gender pay gap that favours men. It's only like 5 or 6% of companies that have a gender pay gap that favours women, and then around 20% where there's a neutral pay gap. So a lot still to be done there. So that was Tuesday. Then on Thursday, we had another report. This time it was the Household Income and Labour Dynamic Survey, which is a kind of annual survey that looks at inequality in Australia. And the really stark takeaway from that report was that despite women's workplace participation increasing over the life of that report, it's been going for about 20 years, men's participation when it comes to unpaid household work has not increased. The bar charts there show it's basically a flat line, despite women's work outside the home ratcheting up. One other interesting takeaway I thought from that report was, despite that rather stark statistic, when you ask men and women about their satisfaction with the division of household labour in the home, most men said, or more men said, this was fine. Women did not think it was fine.
They would say that, wouldn't they?
The more things change, the more they stay the same, seems to be the takeaway from these reports. But things should change. We know there's a few different ways to approach that, and we can step through what needs to change. I think we can start off with workplace. What kinds of policies can we see in the workplace that could maybe turn this around?
Well, I think that the two reports are obviously related, because the pay gaps is not that women and men are paid differently for the same job. It's that there are structural things in the workplace which mean that, women might not be advancing as quickly, and they have to do, like oftentimes with women putting their careers on hold more often to look after children, or being more likely to work part-time and then not being advanced through the organisation as quickly. Then there are also sort of structural things in society that I think contribute to this as well, which is attitudes to what men and women should do. And that goes to the Hilda inquiry, how much work should women do? Is household work, should household work fall disproportionately on women? There are things in the workplace that can address both of those things. For instance, having parental leave for both the primary and secondary carer, or having flexible working arrangements available to both men and women, not just on paper, but actually in terms of being offered. And then also being cognizant of the fact that someone with a flexible working arrangement or someone working part-time is still a really valuable worker, worthy of promotion and through the ranks, and not somehow on what used to be incredibly offensively called the mummy track. I mean, there are things in the workplace that can address both the inside work problems and the sort of societal problems to some extent, but I think there's a lot of other things that need to happen too.
That's true, definitely with the structural changes, but I think it's been the case that often on the parental leave question, even when it's offered equally to both partners, men do not take it up nearly as often.
Which goes to the societal attitudes, which I think is the bigger picture here. I agree.
Yeah, I'm feeling like I'm here to defend all men, which I am absolutely
You're not.
No, you're here as the token man.
Thank you, Bridie.
Just on that, addressing some of the issues here, I guess just one other thing I want to say is these questions are often framed around how can we get women doing more paid work and support women to do more paid work, which is totally valid and something we need to think about. But another question is, how do we get men doing more caring work, more work in the home? Like the fact that men maybe spend less time with their kids, we shouldn't always just look at these things through an economic prism, I guess is what I'm getting at. There is social value in men doing more of that caring work, and that should be a problem that we want to address for, the good of society. It's not just a kind of a women's issue. It's men are missing out on things here too. how do we kind of even this up a bit? Not just how do we push women into more and more work and taking on more and more on top of the housework that they're already doing.
I absolutely agree with you. And I think it goes to the way this debate is framed and the way we have allowed this debate to be framed. I go slightly off my rocker every time I hear someone ask the asinine question, can women have it all? I mean, of course they can't. That question presupposes that you can find some way of doing 2 full-time jobs in one lifetime. You can't. I mean, obviously there are single-parent families and that's a separate question, but in 2-parent families, if the question is framed around can parents have it all, then you can both work out between yourselves however you want to do things, but both participate in the workforce to the extent that you want to and share in the joys and problems of child rearing and household duties as you want to. And I get so angry when childcare questions or flexible work questions are framed only as questions for women, because it is presupposing that idea that it's only women's work, and it's therefore sort of setting women and feminism up for failure. And it's kind of actually infuriated me for decades.
But how do we stop the questions being framed that way? I feel like it's more straightforward to ask, well, what workplace conditions can we change to make things more equal? But it's actually a lot harder and more knotty to say, how do we get men in more caring roles and how do we change societal-wide attitudes?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, but I do think in the media, it's how we frame the debate. People always fall back on that idea of childcare being something for women. We often talk about it. This is for the, childcare is something that appeals to the women's vote. And I just think if you frame it that way, you are reinforcing the underlying assumption that women have to find some way of combining both these jobs on their own in isolation, which can never work and sets women and working women up for failure.
The way a government thinks about it is going to be in terms of legislation and regulations and incentives and all, financial incentives through the tax system or the subsidy system or whatever. Getting at that, how you change attitudes, that's much harder, and something I think it's unfair to expect a government to really have a strategy on. That's a cultural and, there are really long ingrained cultural issues involved here, aren't there? And it's, I don't have the answers on this one, sorry.
But the two things work in concert, right? Like,
of course, you push people in one direction or another. Yeah, absolutely. It's not either one or the other.
Yeah, and I think that the changes that we've seen in parental leave for men, even in just the last few years, are a good example about how reform can drive culture change. Like among men of my generation, in the last few years, there has been a much greater push towards allowing men longer periods of parental leave, both by governments and by corporations. I'm seeing among my own peers and friends and, in my own relationship, men taking periods of sort of 3-4 months off work, which really does reset the gender dynamic within your relationship, which can happen after having a baby, where the woman becomes the primary carer all of a sudden, she's at home more.
The holder of all the knowledge.
The holder of all the knowledge, the booker of all the doctor's appointments, the organizer of the meals, all of that happens all of a sudden for the first time in your life when you have a baby, if you've been a working woman otherwise, and having that period of parental leave for your male partner, which followed my period of parental leave as a mother, completely reset that dynamic. It was so great. And I think that being allowed by workplaces makes it possible for men to do that. It makes it socially acceptable. It makes it the social norm. It changes the dynamic of these relationships. I think change follows change.
And I think it starts to address the issue that I've seen in many women over my lifetime, which is, women usually take the first period of time off after a baby is born, and in that time their partner may be promoted, and then it's not a good time for him to go part-time and her to go full-time because he's already earning more, and then it's never a good time, and then suddenly he's a CEO and she's been at home for 2 decades. Like, I've seen that pattern to some extent play out with so many women I know who have become then quite dissatisfied and resentful in their lives. And I think if you start that sort of more equal sharing of the load earlier, it's easier to continue it throughout your working lives, to share the load in the way that suits you both. Because the truth is, there's never going to be a good time then for him to step back a bit or go part-time a bit. I just think it's really important for lots of reasons.
And this pretty bleak picture of the gender pay gap also comes at a time when Donald Trump is waging what he calls a war on woke. He's trying to shut down DEI initiatives. What could that end up costing society?
I think it has costs across many places, and I mean it's kind of primarily targeted, I think, at racial, race programs. But in the context of this discussion, it could also target any sort of policies that encourage women into more positions of leadership. And, while you couldn't say it across the board, I think women in positions of leadership probably are more likely and more often making decisions that attack these kinds of structural changes, and more likely making decisions that help other women advance through the ranks because they don't have the same sort of stereotypes in their mind as leaders. So I think it is relevant.
It's also coming at a time where we're seeing a rise in what I guess we'll call the broligarchy. What could that mean for women?
I think this period is it's so wild what we're seeing happening in America right now, this kind of roar of patriarchy coming back. Like, it is unimaginable, I think, 10 years ago to think that we would be in a situation where you have this kind of oligarchy of men driven by grievance about feminism and diversity and equality, empowered in the way that they are in America, where Roe versus Wade has fallen, where there is this huge pushback on ideals around diversity and equality. And I think it's really important that we keep collecting information and publishing the reports that we saw this week, because there is so much discourse at the moment that is just not true about white men in America being severely disadvantaged, being overlooked for promotions. That discourse is infecting Australia as well. And we need an evidence-based picture of what's really going on here. The gender pay gap is real. The labour gaps are real. Whatever sort of the richest men in America want us to believe, the data says otherwise.
And it is starting to infect Australia as well. I mean, Peter Dutton was on a podcast in January where he talked about how he thought a lot of young men felt disenfranchised and ostracised, and they were saying, well, hang on, I've got nothing but respect for women and I would never treat my female friends differently than my male friends, but I'm being told that I'm some sort of ogre, or I have some belief structure which is true to what I hold to my heart. And people are fed up and they're pushing back and they're saying, why am I being overlooked at work for a job? These jobs running when I've got, a partner at home and she's decided to stay at home, and I want a promotion at work so that I can help pay the bills at home. And so he's making this point. I mean, this year's WGEA report wasn't out when he was on that podcast, but last year's was, and it shows pretty clearly, as Joe says, in numbers, that most of those men aren't being overlooked at work for a promotion, or at least not in favour of women. I mean, it's devoid of facts, but it's kind of going to that sense of male grievance.
But to link that to question things like, the DEI has become this amazingly weaponized word, which has become to mean many different things in America and increasingly here too. But the actual words, diversity, equity, inclusion, like, who can be against all those things?
I'm anti-equity.
Yeah. And the reason why those kind of programs were started in the first place was because a lot of industries, including our own, for a long time were run by a very small section of the population, basically men, or mostly white men in Australia and in America. And the whole reason why that movement started for diversity, equity and inclusion was to challenge that, and that is still got a long way to go.
And in a corporate leadership sense, also decades of research that shows that having a diversity of opinion at the top of a business, having a diversity of opinion among decision makers, makes for a more successful business.
If this creeping grievance narrative does take proper hold in Australia, do you see this affecting policies in the election campaign?
I don't think that the coalition is going to go sort of the full Trump anti-woke line, because I don't think it would play nearly as well here. But there are there's some hints of it in what they're doing.
I think that the changes that we saw, the shift in voting behaviour that we saw at the last election, with the election of so many independents, Teal independents particularly, all of whom are women in the lower house, does reflect the fact that there's at least a large part of some electorates, particularly former Liberal electorates, that are interested in seeing capable, professional, qualified, reasonable, intelligent women elected and having a say in Parliament, and also having a say on, putting forward positions that will benefit women. Not that obviously that's not their entire focus or even their main focus, but they're not going to be blind to the barriers that have been put in place for women in workforces and other areas of their lives. And I think there's a big appetite for that in particularly in Liberal seats. So there's a restraint on the Libs going too far, I think, and if they want to try to recapture any of those seats or avoid losing more of them.
So we have been having this conversation for a very, very long time, and I don't just mean in this episode. I mean this conversation has been going for decades. Is there hope for change on the horizon?
I mean, I guess some. The WGEA report did show that there was some change in the gender pay gap across workplaces. Workplace laws and norms are changing, as Jo was saying, in terms of men taking or male partners taking parental leave as well. I think the norms in society are very, very gradually changing. And, the Hilda data didn't show they were changing all that much in terms of housework, but the idea of co-parenting is more the norm than it was. The change is slow. I guess countering that is this, what we've discussed, this sort of re-emergence of the patriarchy. Mark Zuckerberg talking about how what his workplace needs is more aggression, because he's learnt that since he's been doing martial arts. I mean, this kind of bizarre kind of discourse in the States will filter in a bit. But I do think here in Australia there has been slow, steady change. Not nearly enough, but some change.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting inflection point. Like what's happening in America is very stark, but like so many things that are happening in America, the sort of question remains to be seen, are they going to import that cultural change to the rest of the world, or does the rest of the world kind of keep going without America?
So, no, thank you.
And now it's time for what we can't get out of our heads this week. Mike, what was that for you?
So this is actually directly related to what we've just been talking about, but our UK colleagues published a piece this week where a couple in their kids' half term had been debating about how much work each of them did in the relationship, and what kind of work it was, and which one was, more valuable or did more of, etc. And so they decided to do an experiment where they would try to swap each other's mental/physical load for a week and see how they got on. So the husband did, the thinking about children's birthday parties and what
Lunch,
food they would
snacks.
eat, and cooking, which, there's obviously there's a particular way they'd previously divided up, and the woman had to think about tidying, which apparently was his big thing. Cleaning was not always the way it's divided up, but also the mortgage and whether they should have a fixed or variable mortgage rate. And it's really fascinating. I mean, everyone divides these things differently, well or badly. But I was quite interested in the way they talked about it, and particularly how they wondered whether what their mental load was, how much of that was imposed on them by the behaviour of the other person, and how much of it they imposed on themselves by stressing about it, by being anxious. Really interesting in relation to what we've been talking about already.
I think that's really fascinating, but you also have to be very careful about at which point you say to your partner, are you just stressing yourself out there?
Totally.
Worry a bit less, love.
Jo, what can't you get out of your head?
So I always enjoy awards season as a perfect kind of escape from my otherwise very news-heavy job. This season was great and culminated in the Oscars on Monday in Australia, which I loved watching and reading absolutely everything about. I thought there was like great moments this year. Timothy Chalamet's yellow suit stood out to me as a sartorial high. I thought it was, bizarre and ironic seeing poor Demi Moore losing the Oscar for The Substance, a film about the sort of anti-aging prejudices of Tinseltown, to a 25-year-old actress, despite being the favourite. That was a bit heartbreaking. I also thought it was really interesting how little politics there were in the ceremony this year, given everything going on. The only really political speech was by the documentary filmmakers, a joint Palestinian-Israeli collective who made a film about the West Bank and the displacement of Palestinians there, gave a really passionate speech. But apart from that, almost nobody spoke on Trump or anything else, which was, perplexing, I thought.
It did feel like it was being studiously avoided. But I do love every year that the Oscars is on a Monday in the Australian time zone. It's a great way to start the week. And Lenore, what can't you get out of your head?
Well, I think what most of our readers and listeners can't get out of their heads at the moment, which is the very slow-moving but very threatening cyclone Alfred, which is about to wreak havoc on southern Queensland and northern New South Wales. We're obviously all preoccupied with how we're going to cover this and how we're going to report on it. But I'm also thinking about our staff in that area, our readers in that area, everyone who lives there. It's a very frightening time for a lot of people.
I think lots of us in Sydney have friends and family in northern New South Wales and southeast Queensland.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for joining me this week, Lenore.
Thanks, Bridie.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Bridie.
And thank you, Joe.
Thanks, Bridie.